Your brother's the smart one. You're meant to support, not lead. My father's words cut through the elegant conference room like a blade, each syllable designed to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. I sat there, stunned, as he continued his announcement to the assembled board members and family. Nathan will be taking over Brightfern Holdings and inheriting the $50 million trust fund that my mother established. My name is Juliet Whitmore, and I'm 32 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've lived in my younger brother's shadow. While Nathan received praise for every mediocre achievement, I was expected to smile, support, and stay silent. But this moment felt different. This wasn't just another family dinner where Dad lavished attention on his golden child. This was my entire future being handed away. The mahogany-paneled room fell silent, except for the soft scratching of the court reporter's pen. Nathan sat straighter in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face as he accepted congratulations from the board members. At 29, he had always been Dad's favorite, the heir apparent who could do no wrong in Richard Whitmore's eyes. I watched him shake hands with our father, both of them beaming with satisfaction. Juliet will continue in her current supportive role, Dad added, barely glancing in my direction. She's always been good at the details, the behind-the-scenes work. That's where she belongs. I forced myself to clap politely, the sound hollow in my ears. Around the table, board members nodded approvingly, as if this outcome had been inevitable. Some avoided my gaze entirely, while others offered sympathetic smiles that only made the humiliation worse. But something flickered in the back of the room, a movement that caught my attention for just a moment before I returned my focus to the family celebration unfolding before me. Nathan was already discussing his vision for the company, his voice filled with the confidence that came from never having to prove himself. I plan to expand our operations significantly, he declared, gesturing broadly. We need to think bigger, take more risks. I bit my tongue, remembering the countless times his risk-taking had nearly cost us major contracts. But pointing that out now would only confirm Dad's assessment of me as a detail-oriented supporter rather than a visionary leader. So I sat there, hands folded in my lap, watching my brother accept an inheritance that should have been earned rather than simply given. The ominous feeling in my chest told me this moment would define everything that came next, though I had no idea just how dramatically the afternoon was about to change. Growing up in the Whitmore household meant learning early that opinions were not equally valued. Dad, Richard Whitmore, had built Brightfern Holdings from a small consulting firm into a regional powerhouse, and he ruled both the company and our family with the same iron fist. My mother, Patricia, had passed away when I was 15, leaving Dad to raise Nathan and me according to his rigid beliefs about gender roles and family hierarchy. Nathan has the natural instincts for business, Dad would tell anyone who listened. He thinks like an entrepreneur. Juliet is methodical, careful, perfect for supporting roles. It didn't matter that I had graduated summa cum laude from business school while Nathan barely scraped through with a C average. It didn't matter that I had spent the last 8 years working my way up through every department of our company, learning the business from the ground up. What mattered was that Nathan was the son, the chosen one, and I was just the daughter who happened to be good with spreadsheets. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Nathan attended networking events and played golf with potential clients, I was the one who actually kept the company running. I reviewed every major contract, caught the accounting errors that could have cost us millions, and quietly fixed the problems that Nathan's visionary thinking created. When the Henderson Group nearly pulled their account because Nathan had promised impossible deadlines, I was the one who worked through 3 weekends to salvage the relationship. When his aggressive expansion into the Phoenix market started hemorrhaging money, I developed the restructuring plan that turned it profitable. But Dad never saw any of that. He saw Nathan's charisma, his ability to command a room, his willingness to make bold decisions without getting bogged down in unnecessary details. What Dad failed to recognize was that those details were often the difference between success and catastrophe. Grandmother Eleanor had been different. Even before her death 6 months ago, she had asked pointed questions about the business, wanted to understand not just the vision, but the execution. She would corner me at family dinners, asking about specific projects, listening intently as I explained the challenges we were facing. Unlike Dad, she seemed genuinely interested in my perspective. "You have your grandmother's mind for business," she had told me during our last conversation. "She built the foundation that your father expanded upon. Never forget that, Juliet." I thought about those words now, as Nathan continued outlining his plans for the company. His ideas were bold, certainly, but they lacked the careful analysis that had made Brightfern Holdings successful. He talked about doubling our workforce within 2 years, expanding into 3 new markets simultaneously, and investing heavily in technology that he clearly didn't understand. The board members were nodding along, but I could see the concern in some of their eyes. These were smart people who understood business, and they could hear the same warning bells that were ringing in my head, but none of them would challenge the heir apparent, especially not in front of his father. A slight commotion in the back of the room caught my attention again, but when I looked, I saw only the familiar faces of our family attorney and her assistant. The humiliation settled over me like a familiar weight as Nathan basked in his moment of triumph. This wasn't the first time I had been relegated to the sidelines while he claimed credit and recognition, but it felt like the most definitive. $50 million in control of a company that I knew better than anyone, handed to someone whose biggest business achievement was not completely destroying the departments I had built. "I want to thank my father for believing in me," Nathan said, his voice carrying that practiced sincerity he had perfected over the years. "And of course, my sister Juliet for all her support. I know I can count on her to help me implement my vision." The words stung because they reduced 8 years of my career to a supporting role in his story. I had always known this day would come, but knowing and experiencing were entirely different things. Around the table, I saw the faces of people I had worked with, people who knew exactly how much I contributed to the company's success, and yet, not one of them would speak up. Corporate politics were more powerful than truth. "Juliet has always been the detail person," Dad continued, his tone suggesting this was somehow a compliment. "She'll make sure everything runs smoothly while Nathan focuses on the big picture." I wanted to remind him about the Morrison account, where my attention to detail had identified a contract loophole that saved us $3 million, or the restructuring of our Denver office that I had designed, which increased productivity by 30% while reducing overhead. But challenging Dad's narrative would only prove his point that I wasn't leadership material. Instead, I smiled and nodded, playing the role I had been assigned since childhood. "I'm excited to support Nathan's vision," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "The company means everything to our family." Nathan reached over and squeezed my shoulder in what was probably meant to be a brotherly gesture, but felt more like a reminder of his dominance. "That's what I love about Juliet," he said. "She's always been a team player." A team player. As if I hadn't been carrying the team for years while he took the credit. As if my ideas and innovations were just team playing, rather than leadership. The casual dismissal was almost worse than Dad's outright rejection of my capabilities. "Well, I think that concludes our business for today," Dad announced, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. "Nathan, we should discuss the transition timeline." As people began to gather their papers and prepare to leave, I caught sight of movement in the back corner again. Our family attorney, Victoria Collins, was standing near the door with what looked like a formal document in her hands. Her expression was serious, almost grim, and she seemed to be waiting for something. The feeling of dread in my stomach intensified, though I couldn't understand why. The worst had already happened, hadn't it? Just as Dad and Nathan began discussing transition plans, Victoria Collins cleared her throat loudly from the back of the room. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from 30 years of legal practice. "Before we conclude, there's something important that needs to be addressed." The room fell silent. Victoria had been our family's attorney since before I was born, handling everything from corporate contracts to estate planning. She was not someone who interrupted meetings lightly, and the formal document in her hands suggested this was no minor administrative matter. "Victoria, what's this about?" Dad asked, his tone shifting from celebratory to concerned. "Can it wait? We're in the middle of—" "I'm afraid it cannot wait, Richard," Victoria interrupted, something she had never done in all the years I had known her. "This directly relates to the inheritance announcement you just made." Nathan's confident smile began to falter. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice higher than usual. "Everything's been settled. Grandmother's will was read 6 months ago." Victoria walked to the front of the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor with deliberate precision. Every board member was watching now, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. I felt my heart rate accelerate, though I couldn't understand why. "That's correct, Nathan. Your grandmother's original will was read 6 months ago," Victoria said, placing the document on the conference table. However, what was read was not her final will. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Dad's face had gone pale, and Nathan was staring at Victoria as if she had spoken in a foreign language. Around the table, board members exchanged confused glances, clearly as bewildered as I was. "I don't understand," Dad said slowly. "Mother's will was finalized years ago. She made her intentions clear. Your mother made an amendment to her will 3 weeks before her death," Victoria announced, her voice steady and professional. "She came to my office on January 15th and executed a codicil that significantly changed the inheritance structure." I felt the room spinning around me. January 15th was 2 days after Grandmother Eleanor had visited the office to review our quarterly reports. She had spent hours going through our financial statements, asking detailed questions about every department's performance. I had assumed it was just her usual thorough approach to understanding the business. "That's impossible," Nathan said, his voice cracking slightly. "She would have told us. She would have told Dad." Victoria opened the document with practiced efficiency. Eleanor Whitmore was very specific in her instructions. She wanted the amended will to remain sealed until the day the inheritance was formally announced to the company. She believed it would provide the most accurate assessment of how the family truly viewed both potential heirs. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Grandmother had been testing us. She had been watching how Dad treated Nathan and me, observing our actual contributions to the business, and making her final decision based on what she witnessed rather than what she had been told. "What does the amendment say?" Dad demanded, though his voice suggested he already feared the answer. Victoria looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. "The amendment designates Juliet Whitmore as the primary beneficiary of the $50 million trust fund and grants her controlling interest in Brightfern Holdings." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. Nathan's face had gone from pale to ashen, and Dad was staring at Victoria as if she had just announced that gravity had stopped working. Around the table, board members were processing this information with the careful attention of people who understood that everything they thought they knew had just changed. "There must be some mistake," Nathan whispered, but even he seemed to know that Victoria Collins didn't make mistakes about legal documents. I sat frozen in my chair, unable to fully process what I had just heard. After 32 years of being told I wasn't smart enough, wasn't leadership material, wasn't the right choice, the one person whose opinion had built this company had chosen me. Victoria continued reading from the document, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's amended will states, after careful observation of both my grandchildren's contributions to Brightfern Holdings, I have concluded that Juliet possesses the business acumen, attention to detail, and strategic thinking necessary to lead the company into the future." Nathan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The golden boy who had never been denied anything in his life was hearing for the first time that someone had found him lacking. Dad, meanwhile, had sunk into his chair as if the weight of this revelation was physically crushing him. "Continue reading," I heard myself say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. Victoria nodded approvingly. While Nathan demonstrates enthusiasm and charisma, his decision-making has shown a pattern of costly errors that could jeopardize the company's future. The Henderson Group contract crisis, the failed Phoenix expansion strategy, and the near bankruptcy of our Denver office under his oversight have convinced me that leadership requires more than personality and good intentions. Each item Victoria listed was a carefully documented failure that I had quietly fixed. Grandmother had been watching more closely than any of us realized, and she had been keeping score. The Henderson contract that Nathan had nearly lost through impossible promises, I had salvaged it by renegotiating terms and working 3 consecutive weekends. The Phoenix expansion that hemorrhaged money for 8 months, I had developed the restructuring plan that turned it profitable. The Denver office crisis that could have destroyed us, I had identified the problems and implemented solutions, while Nathan was taking credit for bold leadership. Furthermore, Victoria continued, during my final visit to the offices, I observed that employees consistently turned to Juliet for guidance on complex problems, while Nathan's involvement typically required subsequent correction or clarification. This pattern suggests that the company's actual operational leadership already rests with Juliet, regardless of official titles or family expectations. I thought about that day in January when Grandmother had toured the offices. She had arrived unannounced, claiming she wanted to see how things really worked rather than getting a polished presentation. I had been surprised by how many employees she spoke with, how many questions she asked about daily operations. Now I understood she had been conducting an evaluation. "This is insane," Nathan finally exploded, his carefully maintained composure cracking completely. "I'm the one who's been groomed for this position. I'm the one Dad chose. You can't just change everything because of some last-minute document." "The document is legally binding," Victoria replied calmly. "Your grandmother had every right to modify her will, and she was of sound mind when she made these changes. I have the medical documentation to support her mental competency, as well as video testimony she recorded explaining her reasoning." Dad found his voice at last, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "She recorded video testimony?" "She did. Eleanor wanted to ensure there could be no question about her intentions or her reasoning. She spent considerable time documenting the specific business decisions and outcomes that influenced her final choice." The room felt like it was tilting on its axis. Every assumption about our family, every belief about the future, every plan Nathan and Dad had made was crumbling in real time. I could see it in their faces. The dawning realization that Grandmother Eleanor had been watching, evaluating, and ultimately rejecting the narrative they had constructed about Nathan's inevitable succession. "In conclusion," Victoria read, "I leave control of Brightfern Holdings to Juliet because she has already demonstrated the leadership qualities necessary for the company's continued success. She has been leading without the title. Now she will have both the responsibility and the authority that her contributions have earned." The silence that followed Victoria's final words was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was the sound of everything Nathan and Dad believed about themselves, about our family, about the natural order of things, collapsing all at once. Nathan was the first to react, standing so abruptly that his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising to a pitch I hadn't heard since we were children. "I've been preparing for this my entire life. Everyone knows I'm the heir. You can't just change that because of some last-minute manipulation." "Nathan," Victoria said firmly, "your grandmother was not manipulated. She spent months observing the business operations before making her decision. This wasn't impulsive. It was the result of careful evaluation." Dad finally spoke, his voice hollow. When did Mother start having doubts about Nathan?" Victoria consulted her notes. "According to my records, Eleanor first requested a review of her estate planning in September, about a month after the Henderson Group crisis. She said she wanted to reassess whether her original assumptions about succession were accurate. The Henderson Group crisis. That was when Nathan had promised a client we could deliver a comprehensive market analysis in 2 weeks, a project that typically took 6 weeks. When the client threatened to cancel their contract, Dad had praised Nathan for being aggressive and thinking outside the box. What Dad hadn't known was that I had spent every night for 2 weeks creating a modified analysis that satisfied the client's timeline while maintaining our quality standards. "She never said anything," Dad whispered. "She never indicated she was reconsidering. Eleanor specifically requested discretion. She wanted to observe the family dynamics without influencing behavior. She felt that announcing her intentions to reconsider would compromise the authenticity of her evaluation." I thought about all those family dinners over the past months, all the times grandmother had asked me detailed questions about work, while Dad and Nathan discussed Nathan's future plans. I had assumed she was just making conversation, but now I realized she had been conducting job interviews. Nathan began pacing the length of the room, his hands clenched into fists. There has to be a way to contest this. Undue influence, mental incompetence, something. People don't just change their minds about inheritance after decades. They do when they learn new information, Victoria replied. Eleanor documented extensively. She kept records of specific business decisions, their outcomes, and who was actually responsible for both the failures and the successes. The pattern she identified was quite clear. "What pattern?" Dad asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand. Victoria looked directly at me before answering. That while Nathan received credit for leadership, Juliet was consistently the one solving problems, preventing disasters, and ensuring the company's actual success. Eleanor concluded that effective leadership was already happening. It just wasn't being recognized or rewarded. The truth of those words hit the room like a physical force. Every board member present had witnessed this dynamic. They had seen Nathan make bold announcements and watched me quietly handle the implementation. They had attended meetings where Nathan's vision was praised and observed me working late into the night to make those visions actually work. Furthermore, Victoria continued, Eleanor was particularly concerned about Nathan's financial projections for future expansion. She had your CFO review his proposals independently and found them to be, in her words, dangerously optimistic and inadequately researched. I remembered those proposals. Nathan wanted to expand into 4 new markets simultaneously, double our workforce within 18 months, and invest in technology systems that would cost more than our annual profit. When I had quietly mentioned my concerns to Dad, he had dismissed them as typical Juliet overthinking. But grandmother had been listening. Victoria reached into her briefcase and withdrew another document. "There's one more thing," she announced. Eleanor also left specific instructions for the transition of power. Nathan stopped pacing and stared at her. What kind of instructions? She was aware that this revelation would be shocking to the family. She wanted to ensure that the transition would be smooth and professional, with minimal disruption to business operations. Victoria opened the second document. Effective immediately, Juliet assumes the role of Chief Executive Officer of Brightfern Holdings. Nathan will retain his current position as Director of Business Development, reporting directly to Juliet. The room erupted. Nathan's face turned red as he processed the reality that he would now be working for the sister he had always considered his subordinate. Dad looked like he was having trouble breathing, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling before his eyes. "This is insane," Nathan shouted. "I won't work for her. I won't report to someone who's been my assistant." "I was never your assistant," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since Victoria had begun reading. "I was cleaning up your mistakes." The simple truth of that statement silenced him more effectively than any shout could have. Around the table, board members were nodding slightly, finally acknowledging what they had all known, but never said aloud. Victoria continued reading. Eleanor has also established a performance review system. Nathan's continued employment and any future profit sharing will depend on demonstrated improvement in his decision-making and collaborative skills, as evaluated by Juliet and the board of directors. Collaborative skills? Nathan's voice cracked. She's my sister, not my boss. Actually, I said, standing for the first time since this meeting began, I am both. And your first collaborative challenge will be explaining to the Henderson Group why your promised delivery timeline nearly cost us their contract. Dad finally found his voice. Juliet, surely you don't intend to actually hold my brother accountable for his decisions? I interrupted. Yes, Dad, I absolutely do. Starting with a comprehensive review of every project he's managed in the past 2 years. The devastation on Nathan's face was almost satisfying. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing consequences for his actions, instead of having them quietly cleaned up by someone else. Dad looked equally stunned, finally confronting the reality that his assessment of our capabilities had been not just wrong, but dangerously misguided. The board will need time to process this information, said Margaret Chen, our longest-serving board member. But I think it's important to note that this transition actually formalizes what many of us have observed for years. Other board members began nodding agreement. Juliet has been the operational backbone of this company, added James Park, our chief financial officer. This decision recognizes existing reality rather than creating a new one. Nathan looked around the room desperately, searching for support that clearly wasn't coming. You're all just going to accept this? You're going to let her destroy everything we've built? What we've built? I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Nathan, name one successful project you've completed without my involvement. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Nathan struggled to respond. Finally, he turned to Dad with pleading eyes. Are you going to let her talk to me like this? Dad looked older than I had ever seen him, the weight of his misjudgment clearly overwhelming. I think, he said slowly, your grandmother knew things about this business that I missed. Victoria began collecting her documents. The transition will be effective immediately. Eleanor also requested that I remind everyone that Brightfern Holdings has always succeeded because of careful planning and attention to detail, not just vision and charisma. Grandmother Eleanor had the final word after all, even from the grave. She had watched, evaluated, and chosen competence over favoritism. The daughter who was meant to support, not lead, was now in charge of everything. The Golden Boy's reign had ended before it ever truly began, and everyone in the room knew it. In the months following the inheritance revelation, Nathan's reputation crumbled both within the company and throughout the business community. Word spread quickly about how the heir apparent had been passed over in favor of his supposedly supporting sister, leading clients and competitors to question every decision he had ever made. His attempts to find executive positions elsewhere were consistently derailed when reference checks revealed the true circumstances of his inheritance loss and the pattern of costly mistakes that had convinced his own grandmother to choose his sister instead. Richard faced his own professional humiliation as colleagues learned that his assessment of his children's capabilities had been so fundamentally flawed that his own mother had felt compelled to intervene from the grave, leaving him to confront decades of favoritism that had nearly damaged the family business irreparably. As I reviewed our latest quarterly reports showing record profits under my leadership, I reflected on how Grandmother Eleanor's quiet observation had validated years of unrecognized work and proven that true leadership often comes from those who are busy solving problems rather than claiming credit. The revenge I had unknowingly earned was sweeter than anything I could have planned. The ultimate vindication that competence and dedication matter more than favoritism and assumed inheritance rights.